Well, good morning. It's wonderful to be sharing here today, and Scott says such nice things. I know I owe him a lot now, but when Scott asks you to do something, I find you can't say no to him. He doesn't let you. I'm really excited to be here today. I grew up in Gaylord. Born and raised in the area, graduated from Gaylord High School, and moved away, but I do need to tell you, I never attended E-Free Church. Wasn't on my radar. I didn't become a Christian until I was 19 years old. But you know what? It is interesting to me how this church has always played a part in my life, even though I refused to come here. And I can remember being in high school 30-something years ago, and there was this group of kids that were constantly, almost to the point of annoying, that kept inviting me to things like canoe trips and youth functions. And they were really trying to get me to come to these type of events. And, I'm proud to say, no, I'm not. I said no to them. But they kept persisting. And so I can remember, E-Free Church being active, in my life in high school. And then I always remember, Alpenfest would come along, and again, the E-Free youth were the ones cleaning the streets. I remember that. And then there was this pastor, Pastor Jim. I always remember him from Alpenfest too, because he always entered the ugly knee contest. Anyone remember that contest? I don't know if they still do it or not. And he always had the same joke about how his knees would be the ugliest because he's always on them praying. And so I remember that. As I went off to college, I came back my first summer, and there was a group of men who invited me to come to a Promise Keepers group that met at the old Big Boy, like really, really early in the morning, and they talked me into going to that. And I can remember them speaking in my life. So you think I would come to church here? No, I didn't. And then when I was going through a time where I was trying to figure out, okay, what am I going to do with my life? I happened to be home visiting my family. I said, I'm going to go try the E-Free Church out. I've never actually been in their building, heard a sermon. And so I came, and Pastor Jim was speaking. This is when the sanctuary was down the hall where the chapel is now. And Pastor Jim preached on Moses at the burning bush. And I want to say, that is to this day the most memorable message I have ever heard in like the past 25 years. He spoke about Moses and his questioning about his calling and everything, and that's where I was at my life. And Pastor Jim preached on that, and to this day I can still remember so many of the points that he brought out. And so I went off to Bible school, Indiana Wesleyan University. That's not far from the lesser Christian University, Taylor. That was for Pastor Jim's sake. And it was interesting. I had my preaching class, and they asked us to critique a sermon. So of course I picked Pastor Jim's sermon, and all I heard from my professor afterward is, "You got to listen to Jim Mathis." He said, "That is amazing. He's one of the most amazing guys I know." And I'm like, man, why does this E-Free Church keep coming up in my life? Many years later, pastoring, and I got to know Pastor Scott after he got here. We became friends. And I went through a very difficult time in my life a few years ago, a difficult time for my family. And Pastor Scott reached out to us. And he said, I know you're coming back to Gaylord, and I want you to come to the church. And I said, okay. I was wounded. I wasn't sure about what the future held, anything. And he embraced my family with he just loving us, so much. And he introduced us to Jack, and who's on staff here as a counselor, and we spent a lot of time with Jack. And, Ephraim continued to speak into my life. So after like 30 years it took for me to actually start coming here. So don't give up on that person you're praying for. God has a way to bring us. And now, I'm here, and I'll admit when I first came, I was hiding as far in the back as I possibly could, and never thought I'd be to the place where Scott asked me, hey, Chad, we'd like you to start being active in a ministry, that online campus. And I love being part of the online campus. There is a great group of people that right now are downstairs on their computers, praying with people, ministering to people all over the place, all over the country. And every Sunday morning we get to experience that amazing ministry. And so we're thankful that all of you have been praying for us and are a part of that. So today I kind of want to talk about the area of selflessness. And as we're coming up to Easter, this is a time of reflection. This is a time where we can look at ourselves and say, okay, Lord, where do I need to grow? What areas of my life need improvement? How can I become closer to you? How can I serve you better? And this area of selflessness is something that I've been thinking about lately. Maybe it's because I really need to look at this. But if you have your scriptures with you, I'd love for you to turn to Philippians chapter 2. Philippians chapter 2, and I'm going to be in verses 3 and 4. And here, the Apostle Paul is telling us, he says, don't be selfish. Don't try to impress others. Be humble, thinking of others as better than yourselves. Don't look out only for your own interest, but take an interest in others too. And then he finishes this verse up with, you must have the same attitude that Jesus Christ had. The same attitude, the same thinking, the same, focus that Jesus had. So Paul's saying, okay, you got to stop putting your own life above everyone else's, and you've got to focus on putting others first. And so I got thinking about that, and I really think all of us want to do that. I don't think there's anyone here that says, oh, I would really like to be selfish. I enjoy being selfish. I mean, even though we do. Every one of us still acts that out in our life. But I don't think any of us really want to be selfish. So this kind of been brought up because I was rereading a book that a Bible teacher at Indiana Wesleyan wrote. It's called Soul Shift. It's about the transforming of our lives, and how God, after we've come to Him, will transform us and create us to be more and more like Him. And I was reading that, and the section about our selflessness is what really came through to me. One of the things we learn as followers of Christ as we start to mature is that we can be a follower of Christ, but our thinking might not yet be there. We want to follow Him. We are His follower. We pray. We read the Bible. But our thinking is still being transformed. And we're still at the point where we're like, Lord, why can't I quite get this correct in my life? Why isn't it there yet? And this is why Paul tells us we need to strive to have that same thinking as Jesus. Why we have to have that same attitude as Jesus. This kind of explains why we can have so many Christians in an area, but see little impact upon a culture around us. The problem is not that we're faking it. It's not that we're too silent with our witness. It's because we need that transformation that goes on in our lives. See, friends, God is at work to mature us, to mold us into the image of Christ. Throughout our lives, here on earth, He's constantly moving us along. And none of us will ever get to an age where God isn't still trying to improve us, right? He's always working and molding us. And it's something that is never completed until the day we're standing before His throne. So, when I look at the idea of a maturing Christian, it's someone who takes a step every day and says, God, transform me into your likeness. Transform me into your image. So as we kind of look at, okay, how do I become selfless with my life? I want us to go to the road on the way to the cross. And if you would turn to Mark chapter 9, we're going to look at this reoccurring conversation that took place on the road to Jerusalem, which was leading to the cross. In the first part of chapter 9 of Mark, we see the transfiguration, where Jesus went and met up with Moses and Elijah, and he first told his disciples, he said, hey, soon I am going to die and rise again. And he gives that first count of what's about to happen. And now we find him on the road with his disciples, and we'll start with verse 30. He says, leaving that region, they traveled through Galilee. Jesus didn't want anyone to know he was there, for he wanted to spend more time with his disciples and teach them. And he said to them, the Son of Man is going to be betrayed. So this is the second time he's telling his disciples this. The Son of Man is going to be betrayed into the hands of his enemies. He will be killed, but 3 days later, he will rise from the dead. Now, they didn't understand what he was saying, however, and they were afraid to ask him what he meant. So we have Jesus teaching really the meaning of sacrifice. Jesus is about to do an act that is the most selfless thing that anyone could ever do. And he's sharing this with his disciples and saying, hey, I want to warn you, but I'm teaching you what it means to be truly selfless. And Mark tells us that his disciples, they weren't catching on, they weren't understanding. And this passage continues further to elaborate how off track these disciples, these men who they've been with Jesus for 2 years now, how off track they still were in thinking like Christ, to have the attitude of Christ. So they were following behind Jesus. Jesus was telling about what's about to happen, but they seemed to have their own conversation going on. They had a different conversation than what Jesus was talking about. In their conversation, we can see what happened in verse 33. After they arrived in Capernaum and settled in the house, Jesus asked his disciples, hey, what were you discussing on that road? Because they were having this conversation. Now, this was one of those, stink moments. I've just been busted. Like when you're at work and you're gossiping about one of your coworkers, and they happen to walk in the room and say, hey, what you talking about? Nothing, just what's going on with the work today. Well, that's how these disciples were feeling. They had just been talking about who's the greatest. And Jesus goes, hey, what are you talking about? No, we know Jesus knew what they were talking about. And he puts them like deer in the headlight situation. And he says, what is it that you were talking about? And verse 34 says, but they didn't answer because they had been arguing about which one of them was the greatest. Jesus talking about how he would die, and they're talking about, I'm better than you. Now, we don't know exactly how they were doing this, but I kind of imagine that each one of them was making a case for themselves in why we're the best. I'm sure Peter, he wasn't arguing, hey, John, he's the man, he's the greatest. And I'm sure John wasn't saying, no, I would definitely go with Philip. But odds are they were arguing about themselves and their greatness. Because the culture of that day was very much about honor. It was very much about who was, the greatest. And they would, jockey for positions and who would be the most important. So Jesus tells them, what's about to happen, that he's going to die and rise 3 days later. And what is their focus on? Who's the greatest? It's probably like walking down the street with a bunch of politicians. Of all of them arguing who would do the best job and who's the greatest of them all. And Jesus says, hey, what you talking about? Adam and Eve in the garden, after sin entered in, what did they do? They went off and hid. And God goes, hey, where are you at? Oh, he knew where they were at. And he knew exactly what they were hiding. And in the same for these disciples, Jesus knew what was going on in their mind. Each disciple pleaded his own case because, frankly, that's their nature. That was the nature that they had. And like I said, we're not talking about rookie mistakes. These guys have been walking with Jesus for 2 years, and they still were not thinking like him. They still weren't thinking like him. And the irony with all this is, while they were following someone with a completely different mindset. In verse 35, Jesus sat down and called the 12 disciples over to him and said this. He says, "Whoever wants to be first must take last place and be the servant of everyone." So Jesus tells them, if you want a place of honor, then you have to lower your own standing and you have to serve other people. Now, this is very countercultural. We don't want to do that ourselves. And definitely in the culture of that day, to lower oneself was a shame. You would not want to do that. They weren't wired to do that. They weren't taught to do that. Because status was the most important thing in that time. And Jesus starts teaching them that status was an insignificant thing. And then, verse 36, then he put a little child among them. Taking the child into his arms, he said to them, "Anyone who welcomes a little child like this on my behalf welcomes me. And anyone who welcomes me welcomes not only me, but also my Father who sent me." Now, Matthew gives a similar account to this event. In Matthew 18. And he talks even more. I like Matthew's details. He talks about the transformation that Jesus was talking about when he brought that child in their midst. Because this isn't just about a cute passage about how Jesus loves the little children, which he does. But this goes so much farther. In Matthew 18, it says, "At the time the disciples came to Jesus and asked, 'Who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?' And he called a little child to him and placed the child among them. And he said, 'Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like a little child, like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever takes the lowly position of a child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever welcomes such a child in my name welcomes me.'" This question is natural in that honor and shame culture that was going on in Jesus' day. The social status, the worth of every person was based on how much honor do I have. And here we find Jesus taking a child and putting him down among their midst. Now, children, they were not valued in that society for who they were. They were valued for their potential someday when they became adults, but children were viewed as one of the lowest members of society. And so to put a child in their midst was not a normal thing. That's why the disciples rebuked Jesus once when he was blessing the little children. And they said, "What are you doing? I mean, this is worse than you hanging out with, all those sinners. You're bringing children in your midst? You don't belong with them, Jesus." I love how Christ always raises people up. Children were looked down in that society, and Jesus raised them up. Women were looked down upon that society, and Jesus raises them up. Jesus looked at the slaves of that society, and he said, "No, we're going to raise them up." That's the way Jesus works. And so we have, the children who rank the lowest in society, and Jesus is bringing them in. And he says, listen, you have to not only, embrace them, but you need to change to become more like them. And he wasn't just talking about you have to have this childlike faith. He was saying you need to transform to understand that your status is no different than theirs. That you have to bring yourself to the same status, just like this child. And that was some major transformational thinking that was going on in that day. Jesus' words were even more challenging than his actions. Sitting with a child, he is telling everyone that unless you change and become like this child, that there is no place for you. He's not only raising the value of children, but he's teaching on the greatness of the kingdom. Kingdom greatness means willingness to embrace low status in the world, to remain at the bottom of that honor-shame ladder, to be humble of oneself, to choose the lowly status for the sake of the kingdom. And he says people who are willing to make that are the greatest in the kingdom. I mean, he's changing everything these people were thinking. He was going so countercultural that he was not very popular with the things that he was saying. So after that, he gets it, right? They all get it, you think? Not even close. You know, you'd think after Jesus' teaching, all his disciples, yeah, okay, we're going to start doing that. But now we're going to go ahead to Mark chapter 10. And here we're going to find this is the third time that Jesus teaches about how he's going to be killed, and he's going to rise again 3 days later. He says they were now on the way to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them. The disciples were filled with awe, and the people following behind them were overwhelmed with fear. Taking the 12 disciples aside, Jesus once more began to describe everything that was about to happen. Listen, he said, we're going up to Jerusalem where the Son of Man will be betrayed to the leading priests and the teachers of religious law. They will sentence him to die and hand him over to the Romans. They will mock him, spit on him, flog him with a whip, and kill him. But after 3 days, he will rise again. So Jesus again tells them about the sacrifice that he's about to make for this world. And what happens? His disciples say, hey, can you do something for us? Verse 35, then James and John, son of Zebedee, came over and spoke to him and said, Teacher, we want you to do us a favor. What's your request? He asked. And he replied, when you sit on your glorious throne, we want to sit in places of honor next to you, one on your right and the other on your left. That's like me going home telling my kids, listen, I got some news from the doctor. I'm going to die. It's terminal. And my son going, hey, can I have your tools? Your car, can I have that too? And so Jesus is pouring out and saying, here's what I'm about to do. Here's what's going to happen. And they're like, hey, can we get the place of honor next to you? Because to the right and the left is the places of honor in that society. And they're saying, we want to be the key. We want to be the one everyone looks at and say, oh, look how great they are. I'm sure the other disciples were not appreciating this questioning going on because they wanted the place of honor as well. And so they're totally missing the point of everything that Jesus is saying here because they were asking Jesus for this position of power. So the problem in both the cases that we talked about this morning is the disciples were following Jesus, but they were wired a different way. They were on the same road. They were walking the same road with Jesus, but they were in a totally different world than where Jesus was at. Even though they followed him for multiple years, they still needed a shift in their life. They still needed something to happen in their life. And this shift in their life had to happen at the most fundamental level of their being. Because they had to shift from me to you. And that's the shift that God calls all of us to make, is a shift from me focus to you focus. And it's one of the hardest shifts that any of us can make. The great reformer Martin Luther, he said something really cool in Latin. And I'm not going to say the Latin, but here's what it translates out to. It says, his heart is curved inward upon itself. As he's describing the very nature of us, our hearts are curved inward towards ourselves. These disciples, their hearts were curved inward towards themselves. That's just the natural way it is. That's how we were born that way. We have a genetic flaw towards self-centeredness. And I don't believe we want to be selfish. It's our nature. It's our very nature. So we'll call this the me first virus that's in our life. And here's some of the symptoms of that virus. First of all, we have a critical spirit. That's a symptom of that inward focus, is we have a critical spirit. We think our ideas are always better than someone else's ideas simply because they were our ideas. Anyone have that problem too? I do. I think it's my idea, so it must be the right way to do something. I think it's my idea, so that's the way we should handle things. When you're driving down the road and someone whizzes past you, you're like, they're driving way too fast. And then there's that person that's really slow in front of you. They're driving way too slow. Even though they might be doing the speed limit, we're basing it on our opinion. And we think, well, our opinion, the way we drive, is always the correct way. We all have road rage. I like this. I don't like that. I have a sign in my office, and I probably now, after the sermon, I have to take it down. But it says, I would agree with you, but then we'd both be wrong. So if you ever came into my office and visit now, you're going to make sure it's not there. What is another symptom we have? Well, we always look out for ourselves first. Don't we? When you check your Facebook page, what do you look for first? That little red number up in the corner that tells how many people have liked something that you've said or have tagged you into a post. Isn't that the first thing that you do? We do, because we want to know, okay, do people like what I'm liking? Are they, appreciating my post to share? Did they like that picture of that meal I just got at the restaurant? Are they jealous of it? Or they make some funny comment about it? Is my cat tricks better than your cat tricks? We're all looking for that. And so we get on social media, and the first thing we're tuning into is me. And we look for that. And we want to go, are my friends tagging me? Or we see a selfie of a friend with another friend, and we go, why wasn't I included in that? And we start thinking about things like that, and social media is just an awful place for us to see how selfish we really are. Or, you get that group photo, and who's the first person you look for in the photo? You look for yourself. You go looking for yourself. In church, we think, is Pastor Scott going to mention my ministry this week from the platform? I hope he mentions me. Or, am I going to get credit for that good deed that I did? So we're always looking, for ourselves first. Another symptom is we have low self-esteem. We compare our appearance, we compare our performance, to a standard that no one can live up to. We put people's standards much higher than ourselves. When Pastor Scott asked me to preach, I really would like to tell you the first thought I had is, okay, I want to focus on a strong biblical message, reaching people for Christ. But, one of the first things I was thinking about was me. I haven't preached in a few years. I'm going to be a little rusty. Well, I wonder how people are going to think about that. I was more focused on that. I'm more focused, I gained a little weight. And, that camera and that lighting already adds 70 pounds. So, I'm a little worried about that. And it took me to, get a slap in the face a few times from God to say, wait a minute, that's pride. That's not humble. That's not selfless. But I'm being selfish in this. Another symptom is we can't forgive ourselves. I'll be honest with you, I have the hardest time with this one. Jesus said, that he didn't come to condemn, but he came to save. Yet, I'm the first to condemn myself all the time. Even when God has forgiven us, our own opinion is still more important to us, isn't it? And we don't want to forgive ourselves. And we struggle with that. And that's probably one of the things that I struggle the most with myself. Another symptom is we become too competitive to win. It proves that we're a better person. So we become competitive. Another area is we talk about ourselves a lot. We always interject our stories into the conversations. We dominate those conversations. We talk over other people. We use those clever tactics like humor to try to get our, point above everyone else's. We find ways to work ourselves into the conversation. We hold grudges. We hold grudges over things that were done to us but not done to other people. And we will hold those grudges. We want to see other people pay for what they did. We refuse to trust people again. And we become bitter towards other people in general. And that's holding grudges. These are all symptoms of this virus, this me virus that we all have. But, I want to tell you, what? Jesus is different. Everything he does for other people, he is completely other focused. He is curved outward where we're curved inward. He is curved outward in every way. So what the disciples were arguing about earlier was contrary to the very nature of Jesus himself. The kind of argument was completely foreign, to his nature. Probably like most of the things we argue about are foreign to Jesus' nature because he's focused outward. So how do we, who are wired more like the disciples than we're wired like Christ, how do we get to a place where we're curved outward as well? And I wish I could say, here's the quick remedy, but it's a journey. It's a journey that we have to take. It doesn't happen in one day. But that first part of the journey is this. We have to face brutal reality. We have to come to the place where we wake up and it occurs to us that our whole life is revolved around ourselves. We have to come to that place. And this is a key place for any change to happen in our life. We have to come to that place where we admit that there is even a problem. The first thing I had to realize when I came to salvation in Christ is that I'm a sinner. And I needed salvation. God had to reveal that to me before any change, any transformation could even come into their life. Is I had to come to that realization. I had to get real with myself that I had sinned and fallen short of God's glory. All change starts with that brutal reality. You want to fix your financial problems? Well, you got to get brutal reality about what you're doing with your finances. You want to fix your health situations? Well, you got to get brutal with that. You got to wake up to that. And these are things we can't do on our own. And what I'm so thankful for is that it's God's Spirit who leads us in this. We can try to do these steps I'm going to talk about on our own, but without his Spirit, it's futile. So we need to ask him to reveal that to us. The second step is we need to take interest in other people. We have to actually take interest in who they are, what they're doing. And let's be honest, our lives are so busy. We've got so many things going on, so many obligations, so many deadlines that are happening that it just seems like it's hard enough to get through ourselves through the day, let alone think about other people first. But some of the things we need to do, we need to start befriending people who can't benefit, where we can't benefit from them. Because it's true, don't we? We befriend people who add to our lives. We befriend the person that, we really enjoy being around. We befriend the person who is going to give us some sort of step up in our own life. But the people Christ befriended were people who couldn't add anything. And we need to look to befriend people like this. And it's hard to do. We say, well, I'm a hospitable person. I'm good at inviting my friends over to my house, but true hospitality is about inviting the stranger, the person who's hurting, the person you don't know, and inviting them into your life. Take interest in the lives of the people around you. You go to school with, you go to work with, maybe people who work for you. Take a genuine interest in their lives. Look at the needs of others that have nothing to do with you. And then listen, and I mean really listen to what they have to say. That means the eye contact. That means setting aside your own thoughts at that moment and listen to what they have to say. And then the third thing is become a servant. When we take interest in people, the truth is we're still in charge. We decide who we're going to help and how much we're going to give them. We decide if our help is appreciated or whether it even gets results. We do that in our giving. We like to know, okay, is my gift going to be appreciated? Is it going to get the results that I want to see happen? But we need to choose to be a servant in a place where we give up being in charge. We make ourselves vulnerable when we do that. But we need to look for the places where there's no reward. And the fourth thing we need to do, and this is the hardest of all, is we need to carry each other's burdens. There is no time we are more like Jesus than we actually pick up other people's burdens and we carry them. That's exactly what he did on the cross for us, isn't it? We take up their infirmities. We bear their sins. We absorb their flaws, their failures. We still associate with them. Galatians chapter 6 says, share each other's burdens, and in a way, obey the law of Christ. If you think you are too important to help someone, you are only fooling yourself. You're not that important. This is much more than simply saying, hey, I'm praying for you today. It's more than just adding someone to your prayer list. When we bear someone's burdens, we are carrying them. We're putting them upon ourselves. We are there to stand in the gap for them, to pray for their children as if they were our own children, to walk alongside them and suffer alongside them, to be in the pain with them, filling that gap. And that's the hardest thing to do. To actually lose sleep over it. To care about someone so much that you would say, I'm going to walk with you even when no one else will. That's what it means to carry our burdens. There's no greater evidence than the cross when we think about how Jesus carried it all for us. And we're called to have that same attitude as Christ Jesus. So my encouragement for you today is just start with that first step and go to the Lord and ask him, Lord, I need you to be brutally honest with me today. What needs to change? Father God, we're so thankful that we're in your presence here this morning. We're thankful for your love, your mercy, your grace. And Lord, I just ask today that you would help us right now discover exactly what area in our life that we need to make this transformation. To go from the me to the you. And Lord, we know we can't do that on our own. We don't have that ability. But through your Spirit, Lord, you can transform us. Open our eyes today to see like Jesus and not like his disciples did. We're ready to serve you, Lord. And we thank you. In the holy name of Christ Jesus. Amen.